Divorced mom laughed at her $1 inheritance next day. Lawyer drove her to a hidden estate. Mrs. Bennett, this is a private estate, and you have no legal claim here. I'm calling security. Actually, Ms. Chen, Mr. Whitmore's letter says otherwise, and I'd like to see the property deed before anyone calls anyone. The marble foyer of the Whitmore estate stretched out like a cathedral, its vaulted ceilings echoing with tension. Claire Bennett stood her ground on the black and white checkered floor, her worn canvas tote bag clutched against her library cardigan, facing down a woman in a designer suit who looked at her like she was tracking mud across priceless rugs. Rebecca Chen's perfectly manicured hand hovered over her phone, her expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. Behind Claire, the elderly lawyer Thomas Whitmore cleared his throat. Ms. Chen, I must insist you step aside. Mrs. Bennett has every legal right to be here. The documents are quite clear. Rebecca's face flushed crimson. This is absurd. David left her $1 as a joke, obviously, and now you're telling me she owns everything, Thomas said quietly. The house, the grounds, the trust, all of it. The $1 was symbolic. It was meant to get her here. Claire's hands trembled slightly, though she kept her voice steady. I don't understand any of this. I divorced his son 23 years ago. Why would David Bennett leave me anything? But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 days earlier when Claire Bennett received a letter that would change everything she thought she knew about the family she'd left behind. The Tuesday morning had started like any other for Claire. She woke at 6:30 in her modest one-bedroom apartment in Millbrook, the same town where she'd lived for the past 4 decades. At 58, her routine was comfortable and predictable. Instant coffee, toast with strawberry jam, and the morning paper spread across her small kitchen table. Through the window, she could see the maple tree in the courtyard turning gold with October color, just like it did every year. Claire had worked at the Millbrook Public Library for 32 years, ever since the divorce. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest and peaceful. She liked the quiet rhythm of stamping books, helping students find research materials, and organizing the children's reading hour on Saturday mornings. After the chaos of her marriage to Marcus Bennett, peace was exactly what she'd needed. The mail slot rattled around 8 o'clock. Claire gathered her things, her lunch bag, her library badge, her reading glasses on their beaded chain, and paused at the door to collect the morning's delivery. Bills, mostly. A catalog from a gardening company. And one cream-colored envelope with an embossed return address. Whitmore and Associates, attorneys at law. Her heart did a strange little skip. She hadn't heard that name in over 2 decades, but she remembered. David Bennett, her ex-father-in-law, had used Whitmore and Associates for all his legal matters. David had been a complicated man, stern, traditional, impossible to please. When Claire had divorced his son Marcus, David had made his feelings clear. She was no longer family, and he never wanted to hear from her again. Claire stood in her doorway, the autumn breeze rustling the letter in her hands. For a moment, she considered throwing it away unopened. Whatever it was, it couldn't be good news, but curiosity won out. She carefully opened the envelope. The letter was typed on heavy legal stationery. Dear Mrs. Claire Bennett, I regret to inform you that Mr. David Harrison Bennett passed away on September 28th. As executor of his estate, I am required to inform you that you have been named as a beneficiary in his last will and testament. Your presence is requested at the formal reading of the will on October 15th at 10 o'clock in the morning at our offices located at 447 Maple Street, Millbrook. Please bring valid identification. If you have any questions, you may contact our office at the number below. Sincerely, Thomas J. Whitmore-esque. Claire read the letter 3 times. David Bennett was dead. After all these years of silence, of carefully avoiding any mention of the Bennett family, of rebuilding her life brick by brick, here was his name again, pulling her backward. She should have felt something: sadness, perhaps, or relief, or even satisfaction. But mostly she felt numb. David had been 76 years old. They hadn't spoken since 1982, the year her divorce from Marcus was finalized. She'd been 35 then, young enough to start over, but old enough to know how hard it would be. At the library that morning, Claire couldn't concentrate. Her colleague, Dorothy Martinez, noticed her distraction during their morning coffee break in the staff room. You look like you've seen a ghost, Claire, Dorothy said. She was 62, had worked at the library even longer than Claire, and had become one of Claire's closest friends over the years. Everything okay? Claire showed her the letter. Dorothy read it carefully, then looked up with raised eyebrows. Your ex-father-in-law left you something after all this time. Apparently, Claire said, though I can't imagine why. He made it very clear I was dead to the family after the divorce. Dorothy stirred her coffee thoughtfully. People do strange things at the end of their lives. Maybe he had regrets. David Bennett didn't do regrets, Claire said. He did grudges and rigid principles and long, cold silences. Are you going to go to the will reading? Claire stared out the staff room window at the library's back garden where a small fountain trickled peacefully. I don't know. What if he left me something insulting, some final message about what a disappointment I was? What if he didn't? Dorothy countered. Claire, you've built a good life here. You've been happy, haven't you? I have, Claire admitted. Then what can he possibly do to hurt you now? He's gone and you're still here. If there's something in that will for you, it's yours. You've earned the right to claim it. Claire thought about that all day. By the time she locked up the library that evening, she'd made her decision. She would go to the will reading. Not because she expected anything, but because Dorothy was right. She had nothing left to fear from David Bennett or his memory. The offices of Whitmore and Associates occupied a renovated Victorian house on Maple Street, the kind of building that Millbrook preserved carefully as part of its historical charm. Claire arrived 15 minutes early on October 15th, wearing her best outfit, a navy dress with a cream cardigan, sensible flats, and the pearl earrings her mother had given her 40 years ago. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, led her to a wood-paneled conference room. "Mr. Whitmore will be with you shortly," she said. "Can I get you some coffee or water?" "Water would be nice, thank you." Claire sat in one of the leather chairs around the long conference table. The room smelled of old books and furniture polish, familiar scents that helped settle her nerves. She'd expected other people, Marcus, perhaps, or David's business associates, but the room remained empty except for her. When Thomas Whitmore entered, Claire recognized him immediately, though he'd aged considerably. His hair had gone completely white, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints protested each step. But his eyes were still sharp and kind. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I know this must be quite unexpected. Mr. Whitmore, it's been a long time." "Indeed it has." He settled into the chair across from her, placing a leather portfolio on the table. "I should tell you up front that this is an unusual situation. You're the only beneficiary I've contacted for this particular aspect of Mr. Bennett's estate." Claire's confusion must have shown on her face because Thomas smiled gently. "Let me explain," he said. "David Bennett was a complicated man, as I'm sure you remember. In his later years, he became quite reclusive. He'd made a considerable fortune in commercial real estate in the 50s and 60s, but after his wife Helen passed away in 1978, he withdrew from society. He maintained his business interests through managers, but he spent most of his time at his estate outside of town." "I didn't know he had an estate," Claire said. "When Marcus and I were married, David lived in that house on Elmwood Street. He sold that property in 1985, Thomas said, purchased a large parcel of land about 10 miles north of Millbrook and built what he called his sanctuary. Very few people knew about it. He was quite insistent on his privacy." Thomas opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents. "David came to me about 6 months ago to revise his will. He was in failing health heart disease, and he knew he didn't have much time. What he asked me to do was highly specific and, frankly, quite unusual." He slid a document across the table to Claire. It was a copy of David Bennett's last will and testament, and it was surprisingly short. Most of it dealt with charitable donations and the dissolution of his business holdings. But near the bottom, one clause stood out. "To my former daughter-in-law, Claire Marie Bennett, I bequeath the sum of $1, and instruct my executor to deliver this inheritance in person, along with the sealed letter bearing her name." Claire stared at the words, $1. After 23 years of silence, David Bennett had left her $1. A laugh escaped her throat, sharp and bitter. "Well," she said, "that certainly sounds like him. One last insult from beyond the grave." But Thomas was shaking his head. "No, Mrs. Bennett, you misunderstand. Let me give you the letter." He reached into the portfolio again and withdrew a sealed envelope. It was thick, yellowed slightly with age, and across the front in David Bennett's precise handwriting was written, "For Claire, to be opened only after my death." Claire's hands shook as she took the envelope. She looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll wait." She broke the seal and unfolded several pages of lined paper, filled with that same careful handwriting. The letter was dated March 15th, nearly 7 months ago. "Dear Claire, if you're reading this, then I've passed on, and Thomas has done as I asked. I hope you'll forgive the theatrical nature of the $1 bequest. I needed to ensure you came to the will reading, and I suspected you might not come if I made it seem too significant. I have many regrets, Claire, but none greater than how I treated you during and after your divorce from my son. I was wrong, not just wrong, but cruel and unjust. You were a good woman who made the right decision to leave a marriage that was destroying you. Marcus was my son and I loved him, but I wasn't blind to his faults. I knew he drank. I knew he was irresponsible with money. I knew he made your life miserable. I should have supported you. Instead, I cut you off completely because my pride and my outdated notions of family loyalty were more important to me than doing what was right. I told myself that divorce was shameful, that you should have tried harder, that you were abandoning your duty. The truth was that Marcus had abandoned his duty to you years earlier, and I was too stubborn to admit it. After you left, I followed your life from a distance. I know you went back to school. I know you've worked at the library all these years. I know you never remarried, that you built a quiet, independent life for yourself. I'm proud of you, Claire, though I have no right to be. This brings me to the true purpose of this letter. The $1 is symbolic. It represents the debt I owe you, the acknowledgement that I gave you nothing when you deserved everything. But I want to correct that now in the only way I can. I have built something over these past decades, not just wealth, though there is that. I've built a place of peace, a sanctuary where I've spent my final years thinking about the life I lived and the mistakes I made. I want you to have it, Claire, all of it. My estate consists of 247 acres of woodland and meadow, with a main house, a guest cottage, and various outbuildings. There are gardens that Helen would have loved, walking paths through the forest, and a small lake where I've spent countless hours in reflection. The property is worth considerable money, but it's worth more than that. It's a place to heal, to rest, to start again if you want to. I've structured everything through trusts and legal mechanisms that Thomas will explain. The short version is this. The property is yours, along with enough money in trust to maintain it for the rest of your life. You can live there, sell it, do whatever you wish. It's my way of saying I'm sorry, though I know it can never be enough. There will be complications. My business partner, Rebecca Chen, has managed some of my affairs these past 5 years, and she may believe she has a claim to the estate. She doesn't. Thomas has all the documentation proving clear ownership and my intentions, but she's a formidable woman and she won't give up easily. I have one request, though you're under no obligation to honor it. In the main house in my study, there's a photo album on the third shelf. It's red leather, quite old. Inside are pictures of our family, including you. There are photos from your wedding, holidays, ordinary days. I've looked through that album countless times over the years, remembering when our family was whole before I destroyed it with my stubbornness. If you can find it in your heart, I'd like you to keep those photos. Not for me, but for yourself. Whatever else happened, there were good moments too, and they're worth remembering. I won't ask for your forgiveness, Claire. I don't deserve it. But I hope this gift will give you comfort and security in your later years. You were always stronger than any of us gave you credit for. With deep regret and belated respect, David Harrison Bennett. Claire finished reading with tears streaming down her face. She looked up at Thomas, who handed her a box of tissues with the practiced ease of someone who'd seen many people cry in this office. "Is this real?" she asked. "All of it?" "Every word," Thomas confirmed. "The estate is worth approximately $4 million, $2 million for the property itself, and another $2 million in trust funds for taxes, maintenance, and your living expenses. It's all quite legal and properly documented." David was very thorough. Claire felt dizzy. $4 million. After a lifetime of carefully budgeting every dollar of shopping at discount stores and patching her winter coat one more year, she was being handed $4 million. "But why?" she asked. "Why me and not Marcus, not his other relatives?" Thomas's expression grew somber. "Marcus passed away 3 years ago, Mrs. Bennett. I'm sorry, I thought you knew." The room seemed to tilt. "Marcus is dead." "I'm afraid so. He had a heart attack. He was only 57. Claire sat back in her chair, processing this information. Marcus dead. Her first thought, shamefully, was relief that she wouldn't have to face him, relief that this inheritance wouldn't become another source of conflict between them. Her second thought was sadness. Marcus had been young. Whatever else he'd been, and he'd been many things, few of them good, he'd been too young to die. "David took it very hard," Thomas continued. "He blamed himself, though there was nothing he could have done. Marcus had followed in his father's footsteps with the drinking problem. After Marcus died, David became even more reclusive. That's when he asked me to help him put his affairs in order. He said he wanted to do one thing right before he died. And that was giving his estate to his ex-daughter-in-law. Not just any ex-daughter-in-law, to the woman he'd wronged most deeply. David was trying to make amends, Mrs. Bennett. In his way, this was his apology and his acknowledgement that you deserved better than what his family gave you." Claire wiped her eyes and read the letter again, more slowly this time. David's handwriting was shaky in places, evidence of his declining health, but every word was clear, deliberate, and painfully honest. "When can I see it?" she asked. The estate, Thomas smiled. Whenever you'd like, I can drive you there today if you're free, but I should warn you there may be some resistance. From this Rebecca Chen? Yes, she's been living in the guest cottage for the past 2 years, managing David's business interests. She believed she would inherit the estate. She's going to be very unhappy when she discovers otherwise. Did David mislead her? Not exactly. She made assumptions and David didn't correct them, but all the legal documents are clear. You're the sole beneficiary of the property and the trusts. Ms. Chen will receive a generous severance payment for her work, but nothing more. Claire thought about this. She wasn't a confrontational person by nature. The idea of walking into a property where someone else expected to inherit made her stomach hurt. But then she thought about David's letter, about his request to see the photo album, about the decades she'd spent rebuilding her life from nothing. I'd like to see it today, she said firmly. If Ms. Chen is there, then we'll deal with it. This is mine, and I'm not going to hide from it. Thomas's eyes crinkled with approval. David said you were stronger than people realized. I'll make some calls and we'll leave within the hour. I've managed his affairs for years. I've lived here, taken care of everything. And you're telling me some random woman. I'm his former daughter-in-law, Claire said quietly. She was frightened, but she kept her voice steady. I know this is a shock, Ms. Chen. It was a shock to me too, but Mr. Whitmore is right. The will is clear. Rebecca turned on her, eyes blazing. You divorced his son decades ago. You have no claim to this family. David thought otherwise, Thomas said. Now, Ms. Chen, you have two choices. You can vacate the guest cottage peacefully over the next week, during which time Mrs. Bennet will compensate you fairly for your services and inconvenience. Or this can become a legal matter that will be much more expensive and unpleasant for everyone involved. Rebecca looked between them, her chest heaving. I won't just walk away from this. I have rights. I'll fight this in court. You're welcome to try, Thomas said, his voice still kind but utterly immovable. But I've practiced law for 43 years, and I can tell you with complete certainty that you will lose. David's will is ironclad. I made sure of it. You'll spend money on lawyers, drag this out for months, and end up with nothing except legal bills. Or you can accept the severance package David arranged, $50,000, and leave with your dignity intact. $50,000. Claire nearly gasped. David had been generous even to someone he was displacing. Rebecca's face worked through more emotions. Finally, she seemed to deflate slightly. I want to speak with my own lawyer. Of course, Thomas said. Here's my card. Have them contact me. In the meantime, I'm going to give Mrs. Bennet a tour of her property. Please don't remove anything from the premises except your personal belongings. Rebecca gave them both a look of pure venom, then turned and stalked back toward the guest cottage. Claire realized she'd been holding her breath. That went better than expected, Thomas said dryly. Shall we? He unlocked the front door, heavy oak with iron fixtures, and led Claire inside. The interior of the house was breathtaking. The entrance hall had high ceilings with exposed beams, stone floors covered with beautiful rugs, and a grand staircase leading to the second floor. Every detail spoke of quality and care, not ostentatious wealth, but comfortable elegance. Thomas showed her through the house room by room. There was a formal dining room with a table that could seat 12, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather armchairs positioned by a massive fireplace, a modern kitchen that somehow blended seamlessly with the traditional architecture, a sunroom overlooking the gardens. Upstairs, there were 5 bedrooms, each beautifully furnished, and a master suite that took up the entire east wing. David lived simply despite all this, Thomas said as they toured. He spent most of his time in the study or walking the grounds. He said the house was too big for one old man, but he built it for the family he wished he'd had, not the one he actually did. The study was on the first floor, a corner room with windows overlooking the lake. It was clearly where David had spent his final years. There was a worn leather chair by the fireplace, a desk covered with papers and books, and shelves lined with volumes of poetry and history. And there on the third shelf was a red leather photo album. Claire's hands trembled as she pulled it down. Thomas quietly left the room, giving her privacy. She sat in David's chair and opened the album. The first photo nearly broke her heart. It was from her wedding to Marcus in 1977. She'd been 30 years old, young and hopeful in her simple white dress. Marcus stood beside her in a rented tuxedo, handsome and charming in the way that had first attracted her. And there was David, standing stiffly to one side, his face stern even on what should have been a happy occasion. She turned the pages slowly. Thanksgiving 1978. Christmas 1979. A summer picnic where she was laughing at something Marcus's mother Helen had said. Helen had been kind, Claire remembered. Helen had tried to be a buffer between her and David's disapproval. She'd died of cancer when Claire and Marcus had been married only a year. There were photos of ordinary days, Claire helping with yard work, Claire reading on the porch, Claire and Marcus at a neighbor's barbecue. In every photo, Claire could see her younger self slowly losing her sparkle. By 1980, the strain was visible in her eyes. Marcus's drinking had become serious by then, and their arguments had become frequent and vicious. The last photo in the album was from 1981, a year before the divorce. It showed Claire sitting alone on a bench in David's garden looking at something beyond the camera's frame. She remembered that day vaguely. It had been Marcus's birthday, and he'd been too drunk to attend his own party. Claire had escaped outside to cry in private. She looked sad and lost in that photo, but she also looked determined. David had kept these photos for all these years. He'd looked at them, according to his letter, countless times. Had he seen what Claire saw now, a young woman slowly finding the strength to save herself? "Mrs. Bennet," Thomas had returned, standing respectfully in the doorway. "I don't mean to rush you, but there's something else you should see before it gets dark." Claire carefully closed the album and followed him outside. They walked through the garden's roses and lavender, herbs and wildflowers, all meticulously maintained, and into the woods beyond. A path wound through the trees, marked with occasional benches, until they emerged at the lake David had mentioned. It was a small lake, perhaps 3 acres, with a wooden dock extending into the clear water. The setting sun turned everything gold, and the reflection of the trees in the still water was so perfect it looked like a painting. "David had this dock built 2 years ago," Thomas said. "He'd come here every evening, rain or shine, and sit for an hour." He said it helped him think clearly. Claire walked onto the dock, her footsteps echoing on the boards. At the end, she sat down on the bench David had placed there and looked out across the water. The peace was profound. No traffic sounds, no city noise, just wind in the trees and the occasional call of a bird. This was what David had wanted to give her, not just property or money, but peace, a place to rest after all her years of struggle. She found herself talking to David, though he couldn't hear her. "I don't know what to say. Thank you seems too small. I wish we'd had this conversation while you were alive. I wish I could have told you that I forgave you years ago, that carrying anger seemed like too heavy a burden to bear." Thomas joined her on the bench. "He knew, I think. At the end, he talked about you often. He said you were the strongest person he'd ever known because you'd survived everything his family did to you and still managed to build a good life." "I had help," Claire said. "Good friends, a job that mattered. Small kindnesses from people along the way. That's what strength looks like," Thomas said. "Not someone who never falls, but someone who keeps getting back up." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. "What happens now?" Claire finally asked. "That's entirely up to you. The house is yours. You can move in immediately, or you can take your time deciding. You can sell it if you prefer, though I hope you won't. David built this place with care, and it deserves to be lived in and loved. And Rebecca, she'll leave. Her lawyer will review the documents and tell her she has no case. The $50,000 severance will be transferred to her account, and she'll move on. These things are always unpleasant, but they pass." Claire thought about her apartment in Millbrook, her 32 years at the library, the comfortable routine of her life. Then she thought about this house, these gardens, this lake. She thought about the weight of David's regret and his hope that she would accept his gift. "I'll need to give notice at the library," she said. 2 weeks at least. Dorothy will understand, and I'll need to pack my apartment, arrange for movers." Thomas smiled. "Then you're keeping it?" "How could I not?" Claire said. "It's the most generous apology I've ever received. It would be ungrateful to refuse." David would be pleased. As they walked back to the house, Claire noticed details she'd missed before: a swing hanging from an old oak tree, a stone bench carved with flowers, a small greenhouse where David must have started his plants. Every part of the property showed care and intention. When they returned to the house, Rebecca's car was gone from the guest cottage. Thomas checked with his office and confirmed she'd called her lawyer and begun making arrangements to vacate. "She'll be gone by the end of the week," he said. "And then this place is all yours." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Claire gave her notice at the library, and Dorothy threw her a goodbye party that left them both in tears. She packed her small apartment, marveling at how little she'd accumulated over the years. Her furniture was old and worn. It wouldn't be needed at the estate. She kept her books, her clothes, her mother's china, and the few photo albums she'd made of her life after the divorce. The day she moved into the Bennet estate, Dorothy insisted on coming along to help unpack. They drove up together in Dorothy's old Honda, Claire's few boxes piled in the back seat. "I still can't believe this is happening," Dorothy said as they pulled up to the house. "It's like a fairy tale." "It feels like one," Claire admitted. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find out it was a dream." But it wasn't a dream. The house was real, standing solid and beautiful in the autumn sunlight. The keys Thomas had given her fit perfectly in the lock. Inside, everything was just as she remembered and more. In her absence, Thomas had arranged for the house to be thoroughly cleaned and stocked. The refrigerator held fresh groceries, the fireplaces had been laid with wood ready to light, and on the kitchen counter was a vase of flowers with a note, "Welcome home." Thomas Whitmore Dorothy explored the house with wide-eyed wonder. "Claire, this place is incredible. You could live here for 100 years and never need anything else." They spent the afternoon unpacking Claire's boxes, which seemed pathetically small in the spacious master bedroom. Dorothy helped her arrange her books in the study right next to the red leather photo album, which Claire had given a place of honor, and hang her mother's china in the dining room cabinet. As the sun began to set, they sat on the back terrace with glasses of wine from the bottle Dorothy had brought as a housewarming gift. "Are you going to be lonely out here?" Dorothy asked. "It's so quiet, so isolated." Claire had wondered the same thing, but now, sitting in the peace of the evening, watching the sky turn purple and gold over the trees, she realized she wasn't afraid of the quiet. She'd spent years surrounded by people but feeling alone. This was different. This was solitude, not loneliness. "I don't think so," she said. "I think I'm going to be very happy." "You deserve it," Dorothy said firmly. "After everything you went through with Marcus and his family, you deserve a palace and servants and breakfast in bed every day." Claire laughed. "I'd settle for a good book and a cup of tea by the fire." "Well, you've definitely got that." Dorothy clinked her glass against Claire's. "To new beginnings. To second chances," Claire added. After Dorothy left, Claire walked through the house room by room, turning on lights, touching furniture, learning the geography of her new home. She saved David's study for last. The room still smelled faintly of tobacco and old books. Claire sat in the leather chair by the fireplace and looked around. This was where David had spent his final years, wrestling with his regrets and trying to make peace with his choices. She pulled out a drawer in the desk and found it filled with more papers, not legal documents, but personal writing. Letters he'd started but never sent, journal entries, fragments of thoughts and memories. One page, dated just a month before his death, caught her eye. "Saw Claire today, though she didn't see me. I was in town for a doctor's appointment and happened to pass the library. She was outside on her lunch break, sitting on the bench under the oak tree reading. She looked peaceful, content. She's built a good life without any help from anyone, certainly not from me. I hope she'll accept what I'm leaving her. I hope it makes some small difference. But even if she refuses it, even if she tears up the will and walks away, at least I'll know I tried to do one decent thing before the end." Claire carefully folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She would keep it with the photo album, a reminder that people could change, that even after decades of stubbornness and pride, David Bennett had finally seen the truth. That night, Claire lit a fire in the bedroom fireplace and lay in the comfortable bed, watching shadows dance on the ceiling. For the first time in many, many years, she felt completely at peace. The house settled around her with gentle creaks and sighs, the sounds of a home rather than a building. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. She thought about the path that had led her here, the difficult marriage, the painful divorce, the years of rebuilding herself piece by piece. At the time, it had felt like failure, but maybe it hadn't been failure at all. Maybe it had been the beginning of a different story, one that was only now reaching its proper chapter. The next morning, Claire woke early and made coffee in the spacious kitchen. She carried her mug out to the terrace and watched the sun rise over the lake. The October air was crisp and clean, and the trees were ablaze with color. She was just thinking about what to do with her first full day in her new home when she heard a car coming up the drive. For a moment, she tensed, wondering if Rebecca had returned. But the car that pulled up was Thomas Whitmore's sedan. The elderly lawyer got out slowly, waving when he saw her on the terrace. "Good morning, Mrs. Bennett. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. Would you like some coffee?" "I would, thank you." They sat at the wrought iron table on the terrace, and Thomas pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "I wanted to deliver the final documents and go over a few things with you. Everything's been transferred into your name, the property deed, the trust accounts, all of it. You're the legal owner of everything." He walked her through the papers, explaining the trust structure that would provide her with monthly income for maintenance and living expenses. The amount was generous, more than she'd earned in a year at the library. "You won't need to work again if you don't want to," Thomas said. "Though of course you're free to do whatever you like." "I might volunteer," Claire mused. "The library, maybe, or something else. I'm not ready to just sit idle." "David thought you might say that," Thomas smiled. "He set aside an additional fund specifically for charitable giving. If you find causes you want to support, the money is there." They talked for over an hour, covering every detail. Thomas was thorough, making sure Claire understood all her options and obligations. Finally, as he was packing up his briefcase, he paused. "There's one more thing," he said. "Thing David asked me to tell you in person after everything was settled." Claire waited, her coffee cup warm between her hands. "He said to tell you that Helen would have been proud of you, that she'd always known you were stronger than anyone gave you credit for, and that she would have wanted you to have this place. He said that in some way this house was always meant for the woman who had the courage to save herself rather than accept a life of misery." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "Helen was kind to me. She was the only one who understood why I had to leave. David knew that. He regretted not listening to her. She told him, apparently, that pushing you away was a mistake, that you were the best thing that had happened to their family in years, and that Marcus didn't deserve you. But David was too proud to admit she was right until it was far too late." Thomas stood, preparing to leave. "I'll check in periodically, but you shouldn't need much help. The property manager will handle the grounds maintenance, and there's a cleaning service that comes twice a month if you want them to continue. But otherwise, this is your home to do with as you please." Claire walked him to his car. Before he got in, she impulsively hugged him. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore, for everything, for executing David's wishes, for standing up to Rebecca, for making sure I understood everything." Thomas patted her shoulder gently. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Bennet. David was my friend for over 40 years. Helping you was the last thing I could do for him, and I'm glad I could do it well." After he left, Claire walked through the gardens, learning the layout. There were separate sections: a rose garden, an herb garden, a vegetable garden that had been recently harvested. There were fruit trees, apples, pears, plums, their branches still heavy with late-season fruit. There were flower beds that would bloom spectacularly in spring. Near the greenhouse, she found a small cemetery plot enclosed by an iron fence. 2 headstones stood inside. One read, "Helen Margaret Bennet, 1925-1978, beloved wife and mother." The other newer stone read, "David Harrison Bennet, 1939-2025, at peace at last." Claire stood at the fence for a long time. David had chosen to be buried here on the property next to Helen. In death, at least, they were together again. "I'm going to take care of this place," she said aloud. "I'm going to make it what you wanted it to be, a sanctuary, and I'm going to be happy here. That's the best thank you I can give you." The wind rustled through the trees as if in answer. Over the following weeks, Claire settled into a new rhythm. She woke with the sun and spent her mornings exploring the property. There was always something new to discover. She found walking trails that led deep into the woods, marked with small cairns that David must have built himself. She found a meditation spot on a hill with a view of the entire valley. She found a small bridge over a creek, perfectly positioned for watching the water flow by. In the afternoons, she worked in the gardens or read in the library. She'd brought some of her favorite books from her old apartment, but David's collection was extensive. He'd been particularly fond of poetry. She found worn volumes of Frost, Whitman, and Dickinson, with passages underlined and notes in the margins. One rainy November afternoon, Claire was sorting through boxes in the attic when she found more of David's personal effects. There were photo albums from before she'd known the family, David and Helen as young newlyweds, Marcus as a baby, family gatherings from the 1950s and 60s. There were certificates and awards from David's business career, letters from satisfied clients, newspaper clippings about his various real estate ventures. And there was another album, this one not quite as old as the red leather one in the study. It was blue cloth, and when Claire opened it, she found photos from after her divorce. They weren't photos of her, those had ended in 1982. These were photos David had collected of Marcus. Marcus in his 30s, looking puffy and dissipated. Marcus in his 40s, clearly still drinking, his face showing the damage. Marcus in what must have been his final years, looking old beyond his age, his eyes empty. Tucked between the pages was a note in David's handwriting. "I failed my son. I saw him destroying himself and did nothing. I thought toughness and discipline would fix him, but all I did was drive him further away. By the time I understood, it was too late." Claire closed the album and sat back on her heels, surrounded by boxes of memories. She thought about Marcus, not the angry, drunk man she'd divorced, but the charming young man she'd married. He'd had potential. He'd been funny and kind when he was sober. But the alcohol had eaten away at everything good in him, and neither she nor David had been able to save him. In a strange way, they'd both lost the same battle. They'd both loved Marcus and been unable to help him. The difference was that Claire had saved herself, while David had watched his son deteriorate from a distance, too proud or too afraid to reach out. She carried the blue album downstairs and placed it next to the red one in the study. These were the bookends of a family's history, the beginning filled with hope, the end marked by regret and loss. But in between, there had been real moments, real love, real attempts at connection. That evening, Claire called Dorothy. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what I want to do with this place, with my time." "Oh," Dorothy said, "what kind of thinking?" "David built this as a sanctuary, but it's too big for just me, and sanctuaries should be shared, don't you think?" "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to open the guest cottage to people who need a place to heal. Women, specifically, women who are going through divorces or escaping difficult situations, women who need a safe place to catch their breath and figure out their next steps." There was a long pause. Then Dorothy said, her voice thick with emotion, "Claire, that's beautiful. That's exactly what you needed 30 years ago." "Exactly. And what I would have given for a place like this back then, somewhere safe and peaceful, away from everything, where I could have taken a few months to heal and plan. I want to give that to other women." "How would it work?" "I'd need to talk to lawyers, set up a proper foundation or nonprofit. But the basic idea would be that women could come here for a month or two, maybe 3, at no cost. They'd have the cottage to themselves, access to the grounds, peace and quiet. I wouldn't intrude or offer unwanted advice, just a place to breathe." "Claire, do you have any idea how many women need exactly that? This could change lives." "I know, that's why I want to do it. David gave me this second chance, and I want to pass it forward." They talked for over an hour, Dorothy's practical mind helping Claire think through the logistics. By the time they hung up, Claire had a rough plan. She would spend the winter getting everything organized, and by spring she could accept her first guest. The story of Claire Bennett and her inheritance spread through Millbrook that winter. People who'd known her at the library heard about the estate and reacted with surprise, delight, or skepticism depending on their natures. Some remembered the difficult divorce years earlier and thought it was fitting justice. Others simply thought she was lucky. Rebecca Chen made one last attempt to contest the will in December, but her lawyers advised her the case was hopeless. She accepted the severance money and moved to Portland, where she started a new business management firm. In time, she would come to see her time at the Bennett estate as a footnote in her life rather than its defining chapter. Claire worked with Thomas Whitmore to establish the Bennett Sanctuary Foundation. The guest cottage was renovated with comfortable furniture, a small kitchenette, and bookcases filled with inspiring and practical books. Claire created a simple application process. Women would write a letter explaining their situation, and Claire would select them based on need rather than any formal criteria. The first woman arrived in early April, when the gardens were just beginning to bloom. Her name was Jennifer, and she was 42 years old, recently separated from a controlling husband. She arrived scared and exhausted, barely able to make eye contact. Claire showed her to the cottage, gave her the keys, and said, "Stay as long as you need, up to 3 months. The grounds are yours to explore. I'm here if you need anything, but I won't bother you otherwise. This is your time to heal." Jennifer stayed for 7 weeks. Claire would occasionally see her walking the trails or sitting by the lake. Gradually, her shoulders relaxed. Her step became lighter. By the time she left, she had a new job lined up, an apartment secured, and a plan for her future. "Thank you," she said to Claire on her last day, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me my life back." "You did that yourself," Claire said gently. "I just gave you a quiet place to figure it out." Over the next year, 10 more women came to the Bennett Sanctuary. Each had her own story, her own struggles, her own timeline for healing. Some stayed only a few weeks, others the full 3 months. Some were escaping abuse, others simply needed space after difficult divorces. All of them left stronger than they'd arrived. Claire kept a guest book in the cottage where women could leave messages if they wanted to. The entries were anonymous but heartfelt. "I came here broken and left whole. Thank you. This place saved my life. I'll never forget it. To whoever started this sanctuary, you've given me hope when I had none left." Dorothy visited often, helping Claire manage the foundation and sometimes chatting with the guests if they wanted company. She marveled at what her friend had created. "David Bennett gave you property and money," Dorothy said one summer evening as they sat on the terrace. "But you're giving something even more valuable. You're giving women their futures back." "It's what he would have wanted," Claire said. "He couldn't go back and fix his mistakes, but he gave me the means to prevent other women from suffering the way I did. In a way, we're doing this together, his resources, my experience." "Do you ever regret the years you lost? The marriage that didn't work?" Claire thought about this. "No," she finally said. "If Marcus and I had stayed married, if things had been different, I'd never have become this version of myself. I wouldn't have learned my own strength. And I wouldn't be sitting here right now, helping other women find theirs. Sometimes the path that looks like failure is actually the path to exactly where you're meant to be." On October evening, 1 year after she'd first received Thomas Whitmore's letter, Claire walked down to the lake at sunset. The trees were gold and scarlet again, the air crisp with the promise of winter. She sat on the bench at the end of the dock, the same bench where David had spent his final years in reflection. She thought about everything that had changed, all the turns her life had taken to bring her to this moment. She was 69 years old. She'd been married and divorced. She'd worked for decades at a job that paid barely enough to survive. She'd been dismissed and forgotten by the family she'd married into. By most measures, her life could have been considered a failure. But sitting there in the peace of her sanctuary, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, surrounded by gardens she tended and rooms filled with memories both painful and precious, Claire knew she'd never been a failure. She'd been a survivor. And now she was something more. She was a guardian, watching over other women as they learned to survive too. A great blue heron landed at the edge of the lake, its long legs stepping delicately through the shallows. Claire watched it hunt, patient and focused, and thought about patience. How it had taken David 23 years to acknowledge his mistakes, how it had taken her just as long to reach this place of peace, how the women who came to her sanctuary sometimes needed weeks or months to find their footing again. Healing took time. Transformation took time. There were no shortcuts, no easy answers. But given space and safety and a chance to breathe, people could rebuild themselves from almost nothing. "I understand now," she said aloud, speaking to David, to Helen, to the memory of her younger self. "I understand why you built this place. I understand what you were trying to create, and I promise I'll take care of it, not just the buildings and the land, but the idea behind it, the sanctuary, the second chance, the hope." The heron caught a fish and lifted off, wings beating powerfully as it rose into the evening sky. Claire watched until it disappeared over the trees, then stood and walked back toward the house. Lights glowed warm in the windows. Somewhere in the guest cottage, her current visitor, a woman named Patricia who'd arrived 2 weeks ago, quiet and wounded, was perhaps reading by her own fire, beginning her own journey toward healing. The house welcomed Claire as she climbed the terrace steps. This was home now, truly home in a way she'd never felt anywhere else. Not because of the elegance or the wealth or the beautiful views, though those were wonderful, but because here, finally, her life had found its purpose. She'd been a wife, though not a very successful one. She'd been a librarian, and she'd taken pride in that work. But now she was something she'd never imagined being. She was a guardian of broken things, a keeper of safe spaces, a believer in second chances. And maybe, she thought as she settled into her reading chair in David's study with a cup of tea and a book of poetry, maybe that was what she'd been meant to be all along. All the pain and struggle and years of rebuilding had been preparation for this, for understanding what it meant to need sanctuary, and for having the compassion to provide it. That night, before she went to bed, Claire opened the red leather photo album one more time. She looked at her younger self, so hopeful on her wedding day, so gradually worn down over the following years, so sad and lost in that final photo. But she also saw something she'd missed before. In that last photo, the one of her sitting alone in the garden, there was something in her posture, a straightness in her spine, a set to her shoulders that spoke of decision. The woman in that photo had been sad, yes, but she'd also been gathering her strength for what came next. "We made it," Claire whispered to that younger version of herself. "All the hard years, all the struggles, we made it through, and look where we ended up." She closed the album and placed it back on its shelf, right next to a new photo she'd had framed, a picture Dorothy had taken of Claire standing on the dock at sunset, the lake and trees spread out behind her. In this photo, Claire was smiling. Not a polite smile, not a forced one, but a real smile of genuine contentment. From broken to whole, from dismissed to dignified, from inheriting one symbolic dollar to owning a sanctuary worth millions. But more than that, from surviving to thriving to helping others survive in turn. As Claire turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to bed, she thought about tomorrow. Jennifer, her first guest from last spring, was coming back to visit and bring her sister, who was going through her own difficult divorce. Dorothy was coming for lunch. The garden club from Millbrook wanted to tour the grounds as a fundraiser for the local food bank. Life, Claire thought, had gotten very full, and very, very good. She fell asleep in her comfortable bed in her beautiful house on her land, with the knowledge that she'd taken David Bennett's guilty gift and transformed it into something genuinely helpful. That was the best inheritance of all, not the money or the property, but the opportunity to turn pain into purpose, to convert regret into redemption. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the Bennett sanctuary, it would shine on a place where women learned that their stories weren't over, that endings could become beginnings, and that sometimes the most valuable inheritance wasn't money at all, it was the chance to start again. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.